Good evening, everybody. Welcome back.
Hello.
And thank you so much for being here. Last time we left the Jews of England on their way out towards France. They had been expelled by the king, and they were impoverished after having been super wealthy. We then had a gap of 300 or so years, and we learned that because of the state of the ages, the millennial aspirations, the messianic aspirations, Jews were eager to come back to Great Britain for a number of reasons, and British people for a number of reasons also, some economic, some religious. Their interest in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament and in Hebrew brought them back. But there was never an official proclamation. It all seemed to be shrouded in mystery, but by the time we get to the 1660s and the reign of King Charles II, who is restored to the monarchy after the death of Oliver Cromwell, then the Jews are in place. They have opened a synagogue. We saw a picture of the famous Bevis Marks synagogue based on Sephardi and Amsterdam Jewish custom, where most of the Jews were now coming from Holland. And then there, as we had said before, there had been what were called Portuguese merchants living in England throughout probably the whole of the time when they should have been expelled. They were living there, and they were pretending not to be Jewish. We had a number of names for them last time, conversos or moranos, and these people came out of the woodwork, so to speak, and identified themselves as Jewish and started to join the Jewish community. So by the late 1600s, we have about 3,000 Jews now living in England, having immigrated there from various different parts of Europe, all of Sephardi origin. And this is a very important point because the Anglo-Jewish community, including the Reform community in England, is based on a Sephardi rather than an Ashkenazi foundation. And there are certain implications for that, which we can talk about later. The other thing I want to point out is that whereas in the medieval period, it was the king who was the bugbear of the Jewish community, and the merchants and the barons, effectively the parliament, who were supporters of Jewish presence because it aided them financially. But it was always the kings that were a problem, and the king eventually was the one who chucked them out. That situation completely reverses itself when we come to what's called the Restoration, because now, in fact, from that point, King Charles II onwards, it's the kings and the queens who become a real strong support for the Jewish community in England, right up to, in fact, King Charles III, as we saw a picture of last week, who knows his Jewish practice. He has his own kippah he keeps in his pocket when he comes to a synagogue, and all of the kings and queens of England from King Charles II onwards were strong supporters of the Jewish presence in England. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't anti-Semitic, and I think certainly at the time of when we think of King Edward VIII, who was the one who abdicated, he was definitely a supporter of Hitler and an anti-Semite. But somehow they were able to keep these things separate in their minds. So they were supporters of the Jews, but they, as Christians and head of the Christian church in England, they were not always favorable to Judaism as a religion, and so exhibited some anti-Semitism. But if you think of some of the great kings and queens like Victoria, George III, they were all very strong supporters of Jews and advocated for Jews in ways above and beyond what they needed to do. And certainly more than, by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century, it's not the Jews anymore who are the kind of the strange people in the kingdom. because you have Catholics, you have nonconformists, you have Quakers. These are the people who are being tolerated to a greater or lesser degree. And we know that from over here because it was the Pilgrims and the Puritans and those people who left England because of what they felt was an oppressive regime. The Jews were quite comfortable in England in the 1630s when other dissidents were not. So it kind of shows you that very, very quickly, Jews at the time of the Restoration came right back with a gusto into British life. I'm going to share my screen, and like last week, as I go through the slides, feel free to ask me any questions as we go. So you should be seeing a picture there of the first rabbi of the Restoration. Jacob Supportus was brought over from Amsterdam, although he was actually Spanish. He was of Spanish origin, and of course spoke Spanish and Portuguese. And in fact, the very first prayer book published, the very first Jewish prayer book published in England in this time period was in Portuguese and Hebrew. English was not spoken by the Jewish community, but rather everything was in Portuguese and in Hebrew, as it actually continues today at the Bevis Mark Synagogue. If you go there, as we said last week, you will have a service in Portuguese and in Hebrew, although there is some English. Certainly the sermon is now given in English. Jacob Supportus didn't last very long in England. The reason being is because it was a terrible time to come back to England. If you think about 1660s, we had the Great Fire of London, we had the Black Plague. It was a terrible time to be in London. And just so happened that was the time that Jews were coming back. So Jacob Supportus, he basically fled from England in 1665, having been appointed rabbi, or what was called in the Sephardi community, they used the title Hacham. Hacham in Hebrew means the wise one. And that's what the Sephardi community call their rabbis. They call him the Hacham. So he was the Hacham of the Sephardi community in London. And he then left, and other rabbis were appointed in his stead through the century.
What was the place of Ladino in the Restoration?
Ladino was very much part of the language that they were also using in the synagogue. But Ladino, yes, was a common language. It was used by the Jews and was important for them.
Did they speak English in the home?
No. There was definitely it's definitely a Spanish-Portuguese experience. So Samuel Pepys was a member of the government and a famous diarist. You probably have heard of him. And on the 14th of October, 1663, he went to synagogue. He doesn't say which one, but because there was only one, it was Bevis Marks. And this is what he wrote in his diary. After dinner, my wife and I walked to the Jewish synagogue, where the men and boys in their prayer shawls and the women behind a lattice out of sight, their service all in a singing way and in Hebrew. And anon their law that they take out of the ark are carried by several men. Thus they carried it about the room while such a service is singing. In the end, they had a prayer for the king, but the prayer, like the rest, in Hebrew. But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention, but confusion in all their service, more like brutes than people knowing the true God, would make a man forswear ever seeing them more. And indeed, I never did see so much or could have imagined there had been any religion in the whole world so absurdly performed as this. And so to supper and to bed. So as you can see, that Samuel Pepys had a strange experience, and from the date we can tell that he was there on Erev Simchat Torah, which was, of course, the day of the carrying of the law around the synagogue, of which there was great merriment and unusual activity for a service. So he kind of came to the wrong service, it seems. So Jews, as I say, are coming into Britain, but they don't have an official status. And it's not until 1714 that there's a question that's raised as to kind of under what auspices are they here in the country. And a series of literature is created. John Toland is called a radical freethinker. He's like a newspaper man of the day. And I'm just going to, it's a bit small to see, but just to read the bottom paragraph. He says, "My purpose at present is to prove that the Jews are so far from being an excrescence," I'm not quite sure what that word means, or a sponge, but we know what that word means, or a useless member of the Commonwealth, or being ill subjects, or a dangerous people on any account, but they are obedient, peaceable, useful, and advantageous as any, and even more so than many others, for being excluded everywhere in Europe from public employment in the state, as they are from following handicraft, trades in most places, and in almost all from purchasing immovable inheritance. This does no less naturally force them to trade in usury, since otherwise they could not possibly live. So John Toland is here saying that the Jews are worthwhile having, that their impediments that have been put upon them before, in other words, only doing low trade or money lending, has only been because that has been forced upon them. That if we give them the opportunity, that they will show what they can truly be, and they will be a benefit to the state. So this was the beginning of a period of time when there was a great discussion in England about how Jews, and indeed Catholics and nonconformists, will become part of the multicultural society. It took a long time for that to happen, and there were stops and starts, and I won't go into all the details, but gradually, the arc of history moves towards justice. So gradually over time, it becomes a situation where Parliament has lots of issues over a period of time, but the establishment, that is the monarchy and the established aristocracy, are in favor of Jews being fully present, which leads to the building of more synagogues and, of course, the immigration of the Ashkenazi community. We have the beginnings of a small Ashkenazi community in the 18th century, which, of course, becomes huge in the 19th century, much like the immigration to America. At the end of the 19th century, we have the same in Britain, from Russia and from Russian lands, White Russia, Ukraine, all of those states. But in the beginning of the 18th century, we have also Ashkenazi, and these are Ashkenazim who are very wealthy, coming from Germany, and we have the building of some beautiful synagogues, including what's called the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place in London, and it's filled with now Ashkenazi Jews who, as I say, are also part of the wealth and the creating of the wealth of the nation. And there could be no more such family than the Rothschilds. As you will know, I'm sure, Meyer Rothschild was in Hamburg, and he sent his 5 sons to a different capital, a European capital. Nathan Rothschild was the one who came to London and formed the London family. And you'll see that his son Lionel, Lionel de Rothschild, became an MP and was the first MP in the House of Parliament, Jewish MP in the House of Parliament, although it was not without some pain for, there's just a picture of the Rothschild emblem with the 5 arrows showing the 5 sons going to the 5 different European capitals to create the bank. So Lionel de Rothschild was elected in 1847, but he didn't take his seat until 1858 because every MP had to swear their loyalty on the Christian Bible and profess to be a Christian worshipper. That oath was in place until 1858, and therefore no Jew could take their seat, although they were elected by the electorate to their to Parliament. So it wasn't until 1858 that Lionel Rothschild, as you can see here, accompanied by his supporters, coming into the House of Commons for the first time, although he had been an MP for 11 years. The Rothschilds were super wealthy, as you know, from their merchant banking, particularly supporting the British government in its empire building and against Napoleon. And this is Waddesdon Manor, which is the home of the Rothschild family. And we will be visiting Waddesdon Manor on our tour. This is just a glimpse of what we'll be seeing.
Could you say the name of that manor again?
It's Waddesdon, Waddesdon, Waddesdon Manor. And keep in mind that this was all happening at the time of the French Revolution and the end of the Ancien Regime in France. And so there was a great deal of interior furniture that was now available. When we go to Waddesdon Manor, you'll see that it has really been filled with everything that had been in Paris at the turn of the 1800s, but was now bought by the Rothschilds to London. So what was everyday life like? So we're looking at 1735. The Jews seem to have about 6,000 souls. They possess houses and villas in which they either dwell or lease to each other. Many of them ride in carriages, and there are some who are wealthy. Jews may dwell in any part of the city that they wish. They may practice any sort of trade or craft, and open a shop in any place outside the city, in the suburb, and even in the city if they've practiced the craft 7 years under a master. They do not become excited in matters of religion, and everyone who is observant is held in good repute. And when occasion arises, each may speak his mind without concern or fear of being indicted, just as one may speak about the king, as it seems. They have Protestants in their employ as maidservants, waiters, servants, and coachmen, wet nurses, and entrust to them without any trouble their little children to be brought up, the suspicion that might baptize them never occurring to them. So in a way, a good report of the Jews, if you like, written by a non-Jew, and they move freely in general society. And it was a good life. And unlike what had happened in medieval times, the relationships were promising and fruitful. However, not all Jews and not all circumstances were the same. We're moving on a little bit more into the century, and at the time now, around the 1800s, that we find out that indeed not everyone is wealthy. So we hear a report that the synagogue administration, with respect to the poor's, aid in at least in the metropolis, very inadequate and ill-directed. Basically saying that now there are poor people and the synagogue has to look after them, but there are very inadequate funds. The funds in these synagogues are raised by the rent. Each person pays for his seat. So that's a familiar, I think, both in North America and in Britain at that time period, that everyone paid for their seat in the synagogue, and that there really is no synagogue fee, and therefore the income is very uncertain. The synagogues are speaking independent of each other, and that, of course, involves distinct interests. All their relief to the poor are dispensed in money at the discretion of the overseers with limitation. And we are beginning to see that there is quite an amount of poverty in the Jewish community, and that the synagogues and the Jewish community as a whole have got to take responsibility for them, but there is no one in overall responsibility. By the time we get to 1760, George III, who is famous to all of you, comes to the throne, and the Jews are very eager to show their deference and their loyalty. And so they send a message to the king to congratulate him. They call themselves the Portuguese Jews. So they're still identifying themselves in that way. They're not British Jews. They're Portuguese Jews living in Britain, although many of them by now might be actually naturalized. And they are giving him their loyalty. And this, of course, is very much different from what happened when King Richard I came to the throne in 1090, and there was a riot and Jews were killed. So this is a very different situation now. They're much stronger and feel much more confident. What happens actually immediately after this is that they feel that there now needs to be a representative body of the Jews, and that you'll see here they decided to establish the London Committee of the Deputies of British Jews. And this organization became known as the Board of Deputies, and it carries on even to this day. And the Board of Deputies, that's supposed to be a picture there. There it is. The Board of Deputies, and this is a picture from 1960 of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Some people call it the Jewish Parliament. You'll see here that they're sitting facing each other, much as they do in the House of Commons. And up here are the officers of the board. The board, much like the federations in America, becomes the representative body of the whole Jewish community. So it now represents Orthodox, Reform, Zionist, non-Zionist Jews who might have come from Russia, Soviet Jews, and Jews from all over the country, from London and from all the regions. And it's a representative body, and it debates monthly and has various actions and activities. And you'll see my father sitting down here as the representative from Birmingham in the 1960s. He was elected to the board. Here we go. One of the most famous presidents of the board was Sir Moses Montefiore. Moses Montefiore was a merchant banker who did very well and basically retired early, and decided in his retirement to do good works. So he spent his entire time representing the Jewish community, both in Britain and around the world, which included representing the Jewish community and the British embassy at the infamous blood libel that occurred in the 19th century in Damascus. And so Queen Victoria wrote to Moses Montefiore in 1841, and you can see here it says, Victoria, by the grace of God, sending a message to Sir Moses Montefiore, in consequence of the information having been received from the East, that a number of Jews have been imprisoned and tortured at Damascus and at Rhodes, and that many children have been imprisoned and almost deprived of food, and several persons tortured till they died, because it said that the Jews had assassinated a priest called Father Thomas in Damascus. So Sir Moses Montefiore with his wife went to Egypt and then to Damascus, and they succeeded in obtaining from the Pasha of Egypt the release of all the persons accused who had been confined and permission, and those who had fled from their homes. And then he proceeded to an audience with the Sultan, etc., etc. So even Queen Victoria acknowledged his good works. And in fact, he became quite a friend of Queen Victoria, and they had a strong relationship. You'll also know, for those of you who've been in Jerusalem, that Moses Montefiore was very involved with the establishment of the Jewish community outside of the walls of Jerusalem, and one of the neighborhoods, the first neighborhoods outside the wall, was called Mishkanot Sha'ananim, which is the place where Moses Montefiore established a neighborhood, and there is still today his carriage in the windmill. He built a windmill thinking that the Jews could make their living from grinding wheat, but the windmill was never really properly used. But inside the windmill today, right there by the King David Hotel, you'll see Moses Montefiore's carriage that he used to come to Jerusalem. We're going to have a lecture on Moses Montefiore when we are in Oxford by a writer who's written about him. Perhaps the other most famous Jew, or there are a number of I couldn't decide which famous Jews to represent tonight. So Benjamin Disraeli was prime minister twice. He's probably, I don't know, he feels himself that he was Jewish, but his family converted to Christianity when he was 13. So he was technically not Jewish, but had a very Jewish cultural background. And as you probably know, Queen Victoria thought he was her most famous and most beloved prime minister. He was prime minister twice and advocated for the Jewish community while he was prime minister as well. Other famous Jews in Britain include the first president of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. He was a chemist, actually not born in England, born in Russia, but came to England, became a naturalized citizen, was very friendly with Sir Winston Churchill and Lord Balfour. And as you know, it was Lord Balfour who wrote that famous letter to Lord Rothschild stating that the government of Britain would favor the establishment of the State of Israel. And Chaim Weizmann then, he actually had to forego his British citizenship in order to become a citizen of the new State of Israel and its first president. He was a very famous chemist, and he produced various chemical productions that were used during the Second World War, which is why he was quite well known to Sir Winston Churchill. Perhaps the most famous British institution that is Jewish is Marks and Spencer, the most famous high street shop. It was originally formed by two Jewish barrel boys. These were boys who worked the markets with their barrows in London, and eventually became the most famous British retail store in England, now in other countries as well. And to my mind, perhaps the latest famous Jewish Brit is Amy Winehouse, who tragically died at a very young age, but with an amazing voice and repertoire of contemporary music. But there are many other famous Jews that I'm sure you know about. I'm going to stop for a second there, just to take any questions before we move into the Reform and the Liberal Jews in England. Any questions or comments about Jews in the 18th, 17th century? Gail.
I was curious about the time in the late 1700s around the American Revolution, from the other side, of course, if the Jews had any interactions around that. But also there was a wonderful book called The Invention of Air about the chemist Priestley, who had started out life in England as I believe, Unitarian minister. It was regarded as, not the right kind of religion. And his church was burned. He fled England. He ended up in the US and interacted with Jefferson and all these people. So I was just wondering about religious intolerance. You were talking about the Jews were starting to get welcomed, but other religions were still very much anathema. So how did that work?
Yeah, no, as I said, I think the Jews were having a fairly good time while the Catholics and the dissenters were not. Now, there had been actually an attempt in the 1630s to send a colony of Jews to Georgia as part of, there were these companies that were putting together packages for people to go and emigrate to the New World. And there was a Jewish attempt to do that. It never occurred. Otherwise, there would have been the first people in America would have been Jews, but that attempt never succeeded. But in terms of the New World, I know that there was some interest in the synagogue about the colonies, and I believe there was a widow at Bevis Marks Synagogue who funded the Plymouth Plantation. And I know that not from England, but from the Plymouth Plantation. They have done some research into monies they received during the time they were setting up in the 1630s. And they talk about this Hebrew lady who sent them money from from the Bevis-Mark Synagogue. So I don't know much more about that, but if anybody else does, it'd be very interesting to know. But Jews, by and large, were not interested in the New World. They were fully European by this point, very culturally British, and in the upper classes, if they were there. And of course, the poor Jews really didn't have any money to leave the country. So I don't think there's a lot of interest in the New World in the 1770s. And by the time we get to American independence, the Jews are very loyal to Britain. And as you saw from the loyalty to George III, the Jews were not going to advocate for the American patriots, but rather were on the loyalist side, which was different, of course, from Jews who were already here, like Rhode Island and other places. And as we know, Jews have always kind of fallen on both sides of every argument. So there were Jews who were loyalists, there were Jews who were patriots, just as there were Jews who were Confederates and Jews who were Unionists in the Civil War. I don't know anything about the other person that you mentioned. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Reform and Liberal Judaism in Great Britain. So I think what we've learned so far is that the British community in the 18th and the 17th century, it's Sephardi founded, but now the Ashkenazi community is larger than the Sephardi community. But the aristocrats are both Sephardi and Ashkenazi. So we have a very rich community that, particularly in London, that is, I should say one more thing about Jews in the 19th century. We do, of course, have Dickens writing about Jews who are impoverished and who are criminals and thieves and beggars, like Fagin in Oliver Twist. So we can't ignore the fact that there were not just these very wealthy Jews, but there were also, of course, evidence of very poor Jews living in the East End of London, probably peddlers and vagabonds selling old clothes, and they, pretty much falling into crime very easily. And for anyone who's read or seen Oliver Twist, you'll know that Fagin is a key character there, although he's a lovable character. And it's interesting that Dickens portrays him in a very lovable way. He's kind of an old codger, and not evil, but rather just fallen on bad times. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And there are other characters in Victorian literature about Jews, obviously, that are written about. But I want to go back to this this wealthy population living now not in the East or in the City of London where they were, but now living what's called Up West. Up West is the West End. So now we're talking about Mayfair, Chelsea, those areas. And the synagogue is still, or the major synagogues are still in the City of London. And it's a really long walk from the West End of London to the City of London. And so there becomes a real petition for a synagogue to be created, what's called Up West. And the authorities, foolishly, in the synagogue in the East, decide that they would not allow a new synagogue to be built. They really didn't want Jews to be kind of moving around the city. They wanted to kind of keep close, which of course created a split, classical split. And what is so interesting about this split from the Bevis-Mark Synagogue is that the split is both Ashkenazi and Sephardi. So you have a group of Jews, all very wealthy, who some of whom are Sephardi, some of whom are Ashkenazi, who want to create a new synagogue together. Now, if you're going to create a new synagogue together in the 1840s, that's got Sephardi and Ashkenazi connected to it, you're going to have to think of a new way to pray. And this is the moment when we move from, if you like, being Spanish and Portuguese Jews to being British Jews, because the very first synagogue in the West End is called the West London Synagogue for British Jews. This is a synagogue that now has an English prayer book. It brings in an English, in fact, an American rabbi from Hebrew Union College. in Cincinnati, and it starts changing the service. It shortens the prayers, and it takes away some of the extra days that have been connected to the festivals. So we would, if we had to give this synagogue a label, we would call it Reform. So it's the first Reform synagogue in Great Britain, but they didn't call themselves Reform. They just called themselves British Jews, and that made a distinction between them and what had been the Sephardi, Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They still separated men and women, so men and women were not sitting together. So in many ways, it was a traditional synagogue, but it was now reformed. And that for 50 years, from effectively 1850 to the end of the century, till 1900, was the only way in which you could pray differently from the Sephardi synagogues or the great synagogue, which meant that really nobody could be connected to it except for the people who lived by or nearby or were very wealthy. And let me give you a picture of the synagogue itself. This is the West London Synagogue for British Jews, and is still there in Upper Berkeley Square. Has anyone been there? It's now the, well, for a long time, it was the headquarters of the Reform movement. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Oxford, but this synagogue is a magnificent Ashkenazi synagogue, and today welcomes visitors from all over the world, as well as its resident community.
Rabbi, is this the same synagogue where the Baroness is one of the rabbis?
Yes.
I took my older granddaughter after she was bat mitzvahed, and I got an invitation from her through Rabbi Berman to visit, and she welcomed us and was very gracious. It doesn't look quite like that now. The men and women sit together, and I don't remember there being two sides like that, because I sat next to a man.
Right. So yes, this is an old picture, and there is now a central set of seats in the middle,
Yes.
where most people sit. Yeah. So this is an older picture of the synagogue. But yes, Baroness Neuberger was the rabbi there. She's just recently retired. She was both Baron and Baroness and Rabbi. She's a member of the House of Lords as well. So as you can see, they continue the tradition of the aristocracy there at West London Synagogue. But it's actually doing very well. It's got a large membership. They have they have two senior rabbis, a male and a female, and it's a great place to go and see and enjoy. They still, on the high holy days, they still wear top hat and tails at the services. Right.
She wore a beret.
Oh, and she herself wears various different. Yeah. Let me see if I can go back to sharing. Right, so that's West London Synagogue. By the 1900s, we get to a situation where there is great poverty in the East End of London amongst the Jewish community and great wealth in the West End. We come to this lady, the Honourable Lily Montagu. She was a young girl when, obviously, at the turn of the century. She was in her 20s, and she decided, both as a Jew and as a young British woman, that the situation was not good enough. And single-handedly, she decided to start something completely new, which was a new movement for Judaism that had a social justice perspective that would encourage Jews to think of themselves as ethically motivated, and that would do something about, first of all, their fellow brethren in the East End, and that secondly, they would look out from their Jewish practice to the the rest of the wider world with responsibility for all. She, as you can see here, this is obviously an older picture of her on the right. She was the daughter of a very, very Orthodox Jew who basically disowned her because of her beliefs in a new type of Judaism. This is a Judaism that she called liberal Judaism. We would probably call it Reform. And her influence came from an Anglo-Jewish preacher whose name was Claude Montefiore. He was a nephew of Sir Moses Montefiore. And up to now, the whole Jewish community had basically been Orthodox or Sephardi. And now these two people, Claude Montefiore and Lily Montagu, decided that we needed something different. And liberal Judaism became the flavor of the turn of the century. At the beginning, they were not thinking that they would be alienated from Orthodox Judaism, but rather they would appeal to a young generation who wanted something a little different. And in fact, Lily Montagu at the beginning she was obviously an extremely charismatic individual, and she recruited Orthodox rabbis who felt also the need to have change, but couldn't go so far as she did, and were supportive of her at the very beginning and of Claude Montefiore. And they created a new synagogue called the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. This is a picture of it. And this is the outside of it. It looks a little bit like Temple Israel, doesn't it, from the outside with the pillars. This was created in 1906. And the synagogue became very full. It attracted a huge membership, and it was very open to all of the arrangements that families had made, perhaps secretly up to that point, including Jews who'd married non-Jews. And although it wasn't yet the time for interfaith marriages inside the synagogue, that will come later, it was very amenable and accessible to all Jews of every stripe, and became the beginning of the foundation of a liberal Jewish movement. Tragically, this synagogue was bombed during the war, and the whole synagogue was pretty much destroyed beyond the pillars. My parents actually were married in this synagogue in 1948, when it was still a bombed out building, and the sanctuary was just a room that they've reconstructed. And in fact, Lily Montagu, I'll go back to her picture. As you can see here, she not only was a leader of the community and of the movement, but she acted as clergy. She was never ordained as a rabbi, but she acted as clergy, and she took services and officiated at weddings and funerals. And she officiated at my parents' wedding in 1948. And although we talk about, the first woman rabbi in America in the 1970s, and the first woman rabbi in Germany in the 1930s, Lily Montagu could be considered the first woman rabbi in Britain. And she was never acknowledged as such, and she never called herself that, but she was clergy and was involved in all kinds of events.
So is she on the left there?
It's the same woman.
Yeah.
It's the same woman, left and right. That's the same picture, the same person, different time. So, as I said, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue was bombed, but it has been rebuilt, and now it's a modern synagogue inside. So it's a bit blurry, that photograph, I'm sorry, but the Liberal Jewish Synagogue is a beautiful modern synagogue, and of course now it's the headquarters of the liberal movement. I don't know if anyone's been there. They have a woman rabbi, and it's a very large synagogue with a great deal of everything that we would be familiar with. The organ on the left, as you can see, the choir, and all of the service would be very similar to what we're used to at Central Reform. The most famous member of their synagogue is Sir Paul McCartney, who with his Jewish wife has been attending services recently. Here he is leaving the synagogue after services. However, unfortunately, we will not be able to go to the liberal Jewish synagogue on our trip, but we are going to go to a synagogue in North London called the Ark Synagogue. They've recently renamed the synagogue. It used to be called the Northwood Synagogue, which is the area of London that it sits in, but they've decided to change it to the Ark Synagogue for a number of reasons, and we're going to hear about that when we go there. But Rabbi Aaron Goldstein is their senior rabbi. He's here on the right-hand side of this picture, and he's standing in front of their ark. There are two parts to the ark. We're going to hear all about this when we go. The middle section is a modern section. The doors open, and they're on an arch. But the arch around the modern section comes from Czechoslovakia from the 1930s. It's called the Kolín Arch, and it was rescued from Czechoslovakia by Rabbi Aaron Goldstein's father, who I think you know, Rabbi Andrew Goldstein. So Andrew is the father of Aaron. This is the father and son dynasty. So Rabbi Andrew Goldstein founded the Northwood Synagogue, and his son Aaron has taken it over. Rabbi Andrew is the emeritus rabbi now, and as I say, he's very involved with a project in Czechoslovakia rescuing items from the Holocaust, and here he is with the Czech ambassador. Rabbi Andrew Goldstein will be giving us a little talk when we go to the synagogue, and Rabbi Aaron will be there as well. And the Goldsteins and the Shires are very connected because Rabbi Andrew is born in Birmingham, where I was born, and his wife, Sharon, who he met in Birmingham, was my first teacher at religion school, and she apparently taught me my Hebrew letters, so she says. However, we're going to be residents in Oxford, as you know. So this is the Oxford Jewish community. It's a pluralist community, meaning that it houses an Orthodox, a liberal, and a conservative minyan, all who meet in the same building. There are a number of prayer spaces in the building, and whoever has the most numbers on any particular Shabbat, for instance, if there's a liberal bar mitzvah, then we will be in the main sanctuary. And if there's a smaller group for the Orthodox, they will be in the smaller sanctuary. They also actually have now a Sephardi minyan that meets on the High Holy Days as well. It serves what's called Gown and Town, meaning that it serves the Jewish community who are resident in Oxford, as well as the university students. So there is a chaplain attached to the university, a Jewish chaplain who holds Friday night dinners for the students and that kind of thing. It's a very active synagogue. And on the High Holy Days, as you know, for the last 15 years, I've been officiating at the liberal Jewish services. That's been a delight. And when we go to Oxford, you will meet many of the community.
Was that where you were last High Holidays?
That's correct. That's where I have been for 15 years, High Holy Days, yes. I don't know why this slide is sitting here particularly, but I know why. There are some institutions that the Reform movement, I didn't say enough about the Reform movement, I apologize. I told you that West London Synagogue originally would be considered Reform. Before the Second World War, a number of other synagogues copied their practice. And if you like, they also became Reform. But they did not want to join the liberal movement that the Lily Montagu had founded. This is a picture of Lily Montagu here in the middle. They did not want, you can see she looks very Victorian, doesn't she? They did not want to join the liberal movement. It was too liberal for them. And so the Reform movement began to grow, particularly after the Second World War, when German Jewish refugees, including people like my parents, and grandparents came to Britain, and they had been more used to Reform Judaism, which was more traditional. And so the Reform movement in Britain is more like a conservative movement. If you went there, you would think of it a little bit more like a conservative synagogue. So in Britain, after the Second World War, you had a growing reform movement that was outstripping the liberal movement, which had been the bigger non-Orthodox movement before the war. So there was only one institution that joined the two of them together, and that was a college, a rabbinical college, that was starting to produce rabbis for both Reform and liberal synagogues. And it was named after Rabbi Leo Beck. Rabbi Leo Beck had been the most important leader of German Jewry before the war. And he survived the concentration camps and came to Britain in the 1940s. And he's accompanied here by Martin Buber, the great philosopher, Lily Montagu, this kind of community builder, and Rabbi Beck. And they created together the Leo Beck College. The Leo Beck College was the institution I worked for 25 years before I came to America. This was the building in which I worked. It's called the Manor House. It's in North London. It's an 18th century manor house, and it houses the Rabbinical Training College for the Reform and Liberal rabbis. And many of those rabbis went to Europe, to France, to Germany, to Italy, to Czechoslovakia, in order to rekindle Jewish life in Europe after the war. And the Leo Beck College has been the institution that has been the outstanding example of how to create new Jewish life in communities that had died or had been taken away. So these steps I walked up for a good 25 years, and it's a very familiar building to me. But the Reform and the Liberal movements continue to be separate. The Reform movement has now grown to about 40 synagogues. The Liberal movement has about 25 synagogues. Altogether, they make up about 30,000 Jews in England. And this year, that's 2023, they have made a decision to bring together the Reform and Liberal movement into a kind of a merger, although they're not using that word. And as you can see, they now count 80 communities around all parts of the country and rabbis who are both trained at Leo Beck College. There wasn't really a reason anymore to keep them separate. These two individuals are going to be the leaders of the new movement. This is Rabbi Charlie Baginski. Charlie happens to be a cousin of mine. She is the leader of the liberal movement. Rabbi Josh Levy on the right is the leader of the Reform movement, and the two of them together will be leading the new joint movement. Charlie actually grew up at the Northwood Synagogue, where we will be going. I don't know if she'll be there when we go there, but she is going to replace me in Oxford for the High Holy Days this year. So she will be the rabbi for Oxford for the High Holy Days. So any other final questions or comments about Reform and Liberal Jews in England and how it's a very exciting time for them? I think we're going to pick up some of that excitement when we get there. We're going to have a little talk from one rabbi who's on the Reform side, and we're going to have another talk from another rabbi who's on the Liberal side, and we're going to see if they have the same message, or indeed there is still some gap between them. It'd be very interesting. There are some Jewish differences between the two movements. For instance, one movement, the Liberal movement, is a patrilineal movement, meaning it accepts Jews who are born to a Jewish father and not a Jewish mother. It also does intermarriage in the synagogues, whereas the Reform movement in England is not a patrilineal movement, but it will convert young Jewish boys and girls before their bar mitzvah and use their bar mitzvah as a conversion process by which they will then be accepted fully as Jewish. So the outcomes of what they're both trying to do is the same, but they come from it from a different point of view. It's a long way from the medieval Jewish period, but it's still the same country. Bob.
Do I infer from what you were saying that the Reform Jewish movement will not do interfaith marriages?
They've just come up with a new policy, and I can't keep up with all of the changes. So we're going to hear more about that when we speak to Rabbi Romain. Rabbi Romain happens to be an advocate for interfaith marriage, but he's in the Reform movement, but he's the strongest advocate for interfaith marriage. So we're going to have an interesting discussion with him about that. I think the current situation is Reformed rabbis can do intermarriage, but the synagogues can choose not to do it in the sanctuary if the synagogue chooses. They doesn't want that to happen. Leslie.
I'd kind of forgotten about the business of, if you were born of a Jewish mother, you were Jewish, and fathers didn't count so much. And I mean, I heard that from way back when, and I didn't know it had changed or where it had changed, or what's the bottom line on that now, or does it depend where you're going to synagogue?
Right. So the Reform movement in America holds to what's called patrilineal descent. That is, that you are Jewish if either of your parents is Jewish. The Orthodox movement only accepts you if your mother is Jewish. And the conservative movement in America, I have to ask Marsha, I think they accept patrilineal Jews. I don't know if anyone knows that. Debbie.
I just wondered where the Orthodox fits into current British Jewry.
Thank you. Yeah. So there are a couple of things I couldn't get to, but I'm delighted that you've asked the question now because I can now mention it. So you remember when that petition went to George III on his accession to the throne. At that time, not only did they create a committee of Jews to come together and be the representative organization, but they also created a post called Chief Rabbi. And the post eventually became known as the Chief Rabbi of the British Empire. And it's a post that for a long time was considered to be really the representative Jew of Great Britain. And the Chief Rabbi was known, and a lot of people respected that office. And some of those post holders of that office you will know, like Rabbi Hertz. Rabbi Hertz was a British rabbi who came to America and wrote the Hertz Bible commentary. If you've got the Hertz Chumash at home, it's a blue volume. He was very well known for that. When he was in England, he was the chief rabbi of the British community. But when he came to America, he actually went to JTS, to the conservative movement. So you could see how Orthodoxy in Britain, because of its Sephardi origins, is not like Eastern European Jews. They are quite modern in their practices. However, in recent times, and this is pretty much under the leadership of the chief rabbi, previous chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks somehow decided that he would rather favor an Eastern European approach to the chief rabbinate, and he decided that he would no longer have anything to do with the Reform movement. So Rabbi Sacks, who's quite famous in the world today as being, a great thinker and writer, was actually the worst chief rabbi we regard in Britain.
Yeah.
He would not attend any of our cross-communal activities, like the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Day School that we created, or indeed Limud, which is our most famous Jewish learning organization. So he would not participate in any of those activities. And in fact, he insulted the Reform movement. We had the death of a very famous Reform rabbi, Rabbi Hugo Grin, who was an Auschwitz survivor. And at his death, Rabbi Sacks said that he was a heretic and not an infidel, but I think it was another bad word, which I don't want to repeat. I know people over the world admire Rabbi Sacks for his writing, but he definitely was was not our favorite cup of tea. So today we have an Orthodox movement that's moved back to the middle of the road. We have a new chief rabbi, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, but unfortunately the damage was done and we will no longer call him chief rabbi. So our title for him now is Orthodox Chief Rabbi, and we regard him as representing the Orthodox community, and he can do that, but we will no longer be represented by him. So as you can see, there are many ways in which the British institutions invite the Jewish community to various things, including the monarchy. And whenever those things happen, those invitations get issued, we insist that our representatives be there. So Rabbi Charlie and Rabbi Josh, those last two people that you saw on the screen, they get invited to the palace, to the Houses of Parliament, to the Supreme Court, all kinds of activities on behalf of what we will now call, I think, the progressive Jewish community, that is the Reform and the Liberal movements. We no longer just accept ourselves as being represented by one rabbi. I'm seeing some hands up. Jane.
Yeah. Sorry, this is an Ashkenazi Sephardic question. And forgive me, it's sort of a family question. One of my cousins by marriage is British and Jewish, and his, as I understand, either his father or grandfather, who was Ashkenazi, was not the chief rabbi, grand rabbi or something of a Sephardic group. Their family name is Gaster.
Yeah.
And the family are, my cousin is pretty secular, but the family is everything from rabbis to ardent communists. So I don't know, good Jewish family. So I don't know all the details, but Robin, my cousin by marriage, did mention that the rabbi of fairly high standing in his family, who was connected with the Sephardi community, was actually Ashkenazi. Can you tell us about that? And, broader interest to people would be, how did it happen? And is that a sign of there being more connection between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities?
Right. I'm aware of Moses Gaster, and he was a hacham.
Moses Gaster.
Hacham,
right.
Which is the word we used earlier for a grand rabbi of the Sephardi movement. I'm aware that he had an Ashkenazi background, but was elected to be the hacham of the Sephardi community. But the Sephardi community are very jealous of their traditions, and they're very rigorous about trying to keep out the influence. So I don't think there is any rapprochement there. They're not going to merge.
Right.
They both consider themselves Orthodox. And so, there's no problem, let's say, an Ashkenazi and a Sephardi Jew marrying in London.
Right.
Although it will not be looked upon favorably, but it's not so much as an intermarriage, but it is not. The Sephardi community are now the minority community, and they feel very entrenched, and they want to protect their traditions. They're, by the way, as I said earlier, the Reform, that synagogue, the West London synagogue, took on some of Sephardi customs. So today, for instance, in a Reform synagogue in Great Britain, you will get songs sung in Spanish. And the Reform movement in England lifts the Torah before the Torah reading, which is a Sephardi custom, rather than after the Torah reading, which is an Ashkenazi custom. So we do have some Sephardi in the Reform movement as well.
Yeah.
I should say, make it clear to everyone that the Orthodox community, unlike America, is the majority community. So as you saw from the slide, the Reform and the Liberal community, they only make up 30% of the entire.
Right.
So we reckon there are about 250,000 Jews in Britain, and that that's probably the same as the number of Jews in Boston. So it's not a big community, but the majority are technically Orthodox. Although many people will say they're Orthodox, but they won't actually do anything at home. And I think in terms of synagogue goers, we've probably in the Reform and Liberal movement, we've probably got the same number of synagogue goers as in the Orthodox community, but they have a lot more power and a lot more influence in the wider world.
Thank you.
Gail.
Back to the time of Ivanhoe, I'm wondering, were there synagogues at that time? And if so, is there any history of where they were or what they were?
Yes, we talked about that last week. And do you mean Ivanhoe the story, or
No. I mean in the 1100s, were there actual synagogues?
Oh yeah. Many more than I wouldn't say more than today, but remember we talked about the English community in the Middle Ages getting up to about 30,000. So and all over the country. So yes, synagogues everywhere. Yeah, it's interesting that Walter Scott, at the time of the Romantic period, wanted to depict Jews in the light that he does in that book. And I know you're going to talk about it, so I won't talk about that now, but that's a very interesting depiction of a Jew by a Romantic writer in Scotland in the 19th century. And there's a reason for that. Great. I think unless there's anything else anybody wants to ask, we are on our way to Oxford, and you will be receiving a schedule of our activities. Many of the things we've talked about will be on our agenda, and some of the people that we've talked about. It's going to be what's the right word? It's going to be satisfying, meaning that it'll both have things to enjoy as well as times to relax and do other things. So it's not going to be running off your feet, but it will be satisfying and edifying. Each day will have something to enjoy.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Have a good vacation.
Thank you.